Your Humanities Half Hour is brought to you by the Northern Marianas Humanities Council.
Hafidades and Taro. Welcome to Your Humanities Half Hour. I'm Catherine Perry. What can we learn from archaeology today? That's the question asked and answered by Dr. Mike Carson in today's show. We're listening in on highlights of his presentation at the University of Guam as part of the Micronesia Area Research Center seminar series. Dr. Carson asks, in our modern world today, what can we learn from archaeology as the study of the ancient past? He says we can learn what was successful and unsuccessful for people who face many of the same real-life issues that we face today. Here's Dr. Carson.
We often think of archaeology as, people like me digging in the dirt and finding old things. And what's the value of that? Why are you interested in these old things? That's from the past, and that's dead and gone. And why are you digging up these old things that really are not relevant to our modern lives? But in fact, they are relevant, and finding old things is important in archaeology. In fact, our field work of excavation is like the heart and soul. Is it worthwhile to do all these things? And the answer, of course, is yes, it is. But there's basic facts that we gain from this kind of field work effort, and those can be interpreted in different ways. You're probably familiar with, the deeper you go underground, finding these different archaeological layers, the older things are. You get the idea that you build these sequences of what did you find through time and tell a story of what happened in the natural history and in the cultural history of whatever site you happen to be investigating. And then you can coordinate these different lines of evidence, importantly in chronological order. And these lines of evidence could be the geological layers themselves, or it could be the things you find in those layers, such as the pottery and other artifacts, the kinds of foods that people ate, what the climate was like, what the sea level was like at that time. Possibly you could learn about population size and density, and I'm sure you could think of many more things, like perhaps the social organization or political structure. When you start getting into those realms, then you need to interpret the data a little bit more. Interpretation is important. We want to know what people were thinking and feeling. We want to know about their religious beliefs and their social organization. So we just need to be really clear about what we know for sure in the facts versus what we are interpreting. So in order to do that, we need to be aware of what archaeology is. As I've shown you, digging in layers and making sure you're very clear about what materials belong to specific time periods. So getting to our question of tonight's lecture, what can we learn from archaeology today? The primary strength of archaeology, there's two strengths. One is that material evidence that we can find, and the second is having a long-term chronological perspective. And this is also shared with history. So many historians the last few years have been looking at things like how did certain situations arise, like looking at the origins of fascist regimes in Europe and other parts of the world, and saying how did that happen, and how can we make sure that doesn't happen again? We don't want to repeat those mistakes. So we look for how did different political regimes happen, or what are the warning signs, and how can we make sure that we don't repeat those mistakes, and maybe if we can identify the causes of these problems, then we can find an effective solution to these problems. And that applies to other things as well, like climate change or increasing sea level. If we can look to not only historical records, but archaeological records, then we can be in a good position to plan ahead for our future. And it's just a matter of, what is your interest? Not everybody is interested in climate change and sea level. You need to think about what is significant. What are we learning that's new and changing the way we think about the world? And in order to do that, archaeologists, the nature of our work is with specific material things from specific sites. So for example, in Guam, we would want to know first of all, what happened in Guam at, say, 1500 BC or at 1000 BC or any other date. We want to know what happened, just the basic facts of the archaeological record. And then we can start to compare with other areas and with our larger knowledge. What I'll talk about today is more about sea level change and coastal ecology. That's something we can document very well in Guam. The coastal environments are fundamental to most of the world's population in terms of agricultural productivity, economic trade, and then so many other things. So if we can look at a real life example of, say, the last few thousands of years in Guam about how people adjusted to changing coastal ecologies and sea level, then we can actually contribute something significant and meaningful that is relevant for some of these situations we're facing today in the world. And as I hinted earlier in this presentation, I'd like to, at least myself, I like to stay as close as possible to the physical data, because in that way I'm observing the data and being objective about my work. And then the layers of interpretation are minimized and importantly clarified. Being really clear about why am I confident in making certain interpretations or conclusions about the raw data. And I like to share all of my data as well, so other people can look at it and come to their own conclusions. So you can think what kinds of questions are relevant and meaningful in our modern world. I mentioned climate and sea level, but there are other things. Population growth and especially population densities are becoming a major issue worldwide, in that there are many parts of the world that have these insanely dense populations and other places that are very low density population. And how can we distribute our resources and our opportunities for everyone to have equal advantage? There's some concerns about what happens when you have new religious doctrines or beliefs that suddenly influence different regions, and having different religious beliefs and diversity is generally a good thing, but often things get misinterpreted, and archaeologists, not myself, but others working in Egypt and other places have been starting to look at that question of how do religions change the way we think, and how does it affect different aspects of our society. Another one, of course, would be warfare. Wars generally are things that we want to avoid, and in the archaeological record we have plenty of examples of conflict and violence and battlefields and other things. And if archaeologists can learn about what happens leading up to warfare and conflict situations, then perhaps that will help us to avoid those kinds of situations in the future. Understanding how those things happened is important for developing effective solutions in the future. And I'm sure you can think of many other things that are problems in our modern world. And you can think of it this way: if the historical context about something is helpful to make sense of how a problem happened or how to solve it, then archaeology also could be helpful, looking in a long-term perspective with real tangible examples. And today I will talk about just a little bit of some of this at the Rutidian or Litexan site in northern Guam. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the story of the child's leap going across to Rota. This isn't the exact spot where that happened in the legend, but it evokes that aspect. And I won't go into detail right now, but the last about 20 years, we've had very solid evidence of a higher sea level that existed actually throughout the world between 3000 BC and 1000 BC, and in the Pacific region in particular is very, very well documented. But of course it changes a little bit from, here to there and through time. If I find a site that dates to a specific point on this timeline, I can already know what the sea level was at that time. Right, so you already have that built-in reference point. And then you can look for verifying information just to be sure in that particular place. But working at the Litexan site has been especially helpful because many of our observations about changing sea level are directly at that site and even from the archaeological excavations themselves. So we can be very sure of coordinating things like this. So I can show what the landscape looked like when people first lived in the region. About between 1500 BC and 1100 BC would have been the limestone formations coming essentially right down to the edge of the ocean, and people living in just a few small spots. And then with sea level starting to change, actually becoming a little bit lower, and then the coast is expanding and people are living in a larger area, and then those trends continue until there's a new coral reef forming, which is the reef that you can see today. And people, by the time of the Latte period, and people are living in Latte villages, is more intensive land use over a much larger area. So you can put this whole sequence together. During that period of higher sea level, people were making certain kinds of pottery. They also were doing other certain kinds of things with stone tools or shell ornaments. And then during the next period of a falling sea level, that coordinates a little bit with some of the change in the pottery traditions, but certain aspects continued while others changed. You can look at what changed in those different periods as well as what had sustained through time. So if you're interested in sustainable planning for the future, then both of those things are important. You need to know what kinds of things are people able to do that continue and endure and sustain through changing times, and what things are people doing that really cannot survive, that are no longer relevant in their lives with too much of a threshold, changing condition. And you could apply this logic to other things. And I mentioned lines of evidence. This is very important. You need a full picture of what happened. If I'm looking only at the pottery, like I showed you, then I can address only certain kinds of questions. If I broaden my lines of evidence, then I can talk about more things. What I'm showing here is, a few of the things that we're able to study clearly in the archaeological record, like the climate, the kinds of resource habitats, the artifact technology, the food supply, population size, social organization. Sometimes we can address, but not always. And there's many other things that we could try to find in the archaeological record. But if our window is too shallow, like say we dig only a little bit and we find, say, the last 100 years or 200 years or the last 500 years even of the archaeological record, then we're not really looking at change through time. We can't really address what was sustainable. We need a much deeper look into the past.
This is Your Humanities Half Hour. We'll be back with more after this break.
Did you know that you can donate up to $5,000 to the Humanities Council through the Cnmi Education Tax Credit Program? Donations from individuals and corporations qualify and can be used to offset your local wage and salary tax, BGRT, and earnings tax. Call our office at 235-4785 to see how you can support humanities programs in our community and obtain a tax credit for your donation. Sizuus Maasi, Olomai, and thank you.
Welcome back to Your Humanities Half Hour. We're listening in on highlights of a presentation by Archeologist Dr. Mike Carson, made at the University of Guam as part of the Micronesia Area Research Center seminar series. His lecture is, What Can We Learn from Archaeology Today?
A significant finding is something new that changes the way we think about the world. So whatever your question is that's important to you, whether it's sea level or climate or whether it's population dynamics, how does this physical evidence help get to that question? And it may not. There may be problems in the logical link. And if that happens, then you need to address it. Find out what other lines of evidence do you need. So this leads me to my next point of how can we improve or enhance our contributions? And generally there are three ways. The first is what I showed you earlier, having different lines of evidence. The more lines of evidence you have, the more knowledgeable you are about the past and what changed in our natural and in our cultural history. The second thing is having a cross-regional perspective. So looking just at the Texan site is important, but what makes it more important is if I can look at other sites in other parts of the Asia and Pacific region, like in New Guinea or in Taiwan or in the Philippines or Okinawa, and saying, okay, at 1100 BC there was a change in sea level in Guam and people responded in a certain way. That same sea level change happened at the same time in these other regions, so how did people respond there? So that's the power of the cross-regional perspective. The third thing we can do to improve or enhance our contribution is this long-term chronological perspective. And I regard that as one of the primary strengths of archaeology, is having that long-term chronological perspective. And I believe we need to do more work on that. Not everybody is looking at chronology in the way that we could. It could be more powerful. And it's as I've shown you here, that long-term perspective allows us to see what changed through time versus what was sustainable through time. And that is really at the core of making policies and planning for the future. So those are the three ways we can enhance our contributions. There's the multiple lines of evidence, there's the cross-regional perspective, and then the third point is the long-term chronological perspective. And most of my colleagues naturally would agree with me about those things. But then I would add a fourth one that we often overlook, and that is sharing information and having public outreach and activities and experiences for people who are not necessarily archaeologists. Archaeologists have a responsibility to share information, not just to make it available, but to make sure that it's accurate and gets into the hands of the people who want to know about it. Now getting back to our key question, what can we learn from archaeology today? And potentially how it can help towards solving problems that are in our modern world and in our future concerns, worldwide concerns about where we're headed in our future.
Is there anything archaeological where we can learn their governance, the way they governed,
yes. their like political organization?
Yes.
Yeah, we can. In the older time periods, it's a bit unclear because of the way the evidence is. The best forms of evidence for political organization come from, say, house structures, right? Are certain houses, how are they organized and how do they relate with each other? So for the very old time periods, you would need to dig, deep under the ground just to find them. So we don't really see complete houses and villages. We see windows into the past. So we can't really do it for the older time periods. For the Latte period, however, we can see whole villages and reconstruct how things were organized. And we can look for, say, differential patterns in who had access to different kinds of resources. Were some houses or villages controlling or situated in places that would control access to things like water resources, and that starts to get at your question, but it doesn't really answer it, but it starts getting you in the right direction. So we can start to come up with some ideas about that, but given the nature of the archaeological evidence, we haven't really been able to address it conclusively.
Can we say they were free people?
I can't say yes or no. based purely on the archaeological evidence, I couldn't say that. For that, I actually would think the best clues would be in the Chamorro language about kinship and how things are organized. Speaking as an archaeologist and anthropologist, I can say worldwide, most societies have a natural biological division of labor based on, are you younger or older, and male and female, because all of us, whether we like it or not, have those traits. And that's just a natural way of dividing the labor that needs to be done, to maintain your society. So what are the words in Chamorro language that refer to those kinds of things? And are there clues in the Chamorro language about labor organization, like how are tasks visualized?
How about the description that we are a matrilineal society? Is that evident in archaeology?
No, that's not evident in archaeology, but it's definitely clear in language, and it's definitely clear cross-regionally, looking at places where cultural traditions have survived through that colonial imperialistic period. You can look at places all across Micronesia that definitely retained a matrilineal clan formation. Yeah, definitely. And some of the genetic studies seem to point to that as well, but that's not 100% conclusive. So I would say the weight of evidence right now is pointing toward, matrilineal society. And then the only question would be, how far back in time do you extend it? And based on the cross-regional splits of language and societies in archaeological time, that would be at least 2,000 years ago, and it probably is older than that.
You mentioned the Chamorro Wars. What evidence have you come up with in regard to indicators of the Spanish Chamorro Wars at the Letecjan site? That's
actually just in written documents. The Jesuits made an outpost at the site.
That was a chapel that is located there, right?
Well, it's not. It was a chapel plus a few other things, and then it was rebuilt a number of times. And according the way the Jesuit records worked, sometimes the location was not really here. It may have been at Henopsin, but anyway, there are direct references to that spot, and we did find the traces of where it was. It's been destroyed, now, and it no longer exists, but the traces of it are under the ground now. And so 1670s through 1680s is when this was in operation, and there's references to specific things that happened right there, including using lathi, taking Tassa and Haligi to make some of the foundations of one of the buildings.
That's why I'm asking if there was any evidence of that. I mean, you have the site, and other archaeologists have confirmed that there was a chapel there.
Yeah.
But what evidence in relationship to the narrative that's existing did you find at Letecjan for that?
Well, you find the traces of the building itself, under the ground, and and then at some of the lathi, not all of them, we do find glass beads and large, square cut iron from ships that date. They could only date to the late 1600s, so that puts you in that time range. And then the archaeological evidence also points to everything being abandoned shortly thereafter. Like by the year 1700, nobody living at the site as a village. And then the next evidence we see is in the early 1800s as a Spanish crown land being used as an agricultural area. And that's when those large crater-shaped wells were dug into the area. And we find some blue on white porcelain that dates to the 1820s around those wells. So that's the next use. It's like more than 100 years later, So We can be fairly confident pointing to say like the year 1700. It could be a little earlier, but 1700, by that time the village system would have been abandoned, but the place would have been used in a different way or perceived in a different way. Yes?
Could you briefly describe what the area was like pre-contact around 1450?
Around 1450. Okay, so the coral reef that you see today is the same coral reef that would have been there at that time. The places where you gather water, like the seeps that come out just above sea level, would have been in the same places that you see today. The extent of the village, like Laddie Village, is pretty much what I show here. It shows one big continuous thing. It actually was probably two villages, but close enough that we would draw it as one large area. And then a number of outlying, like outpost type houses in the upper limestone forest, as well as caves that are used for specialized purposes. Importantly, the coral reef would have been similar to what it is today, and that includes a number of openings in it. One of them you can almost see on this image, one of the openings in the reef, and that's very important for communication with the rest of the world, especially going across the Rota Channel. There's actually many traditions connecting Rota and northern Guam. And I would like to learn more about that. But archaeologically, I can say that like the pottery traditions we find in northern Guam, especially at the Texan site, share more similarities with Rota than they do with southern Guam. So I think that's quite fascinating. But more about your question, what did the place look like? That's pretty much the extent of what I can say as an archaeologist. The forest composition is something people ask. And it would have looked, the way the wildlife refuge looks today is actually a really good indicator of what it would have looked like during pre-contact times. There would have been, it would have been a place with different kinds of forest. What we would call managed forest, not virgin natural forest, but managed forest. So people are selecting the kinds of things that are useful for them, but they're not like high density orchards. You know, it's definitely forest growing by itself, but people are just selecting things like the kinds of wood they need for their houses, the kinds of food they want to eat, and so forth. And we find that not only living today, but in the archaeological deposits, we find burned wood or pieces of what we will call charcoal in our terminology. And you can look at the wood structure and you can identify what that was. Mostly what people are burning, like in their hearths and cooking areas, is coconut. But there are other things.
We've been listening to excerpts from a lecture by archaeologist Dr. Mike Carson, made as part of the Micronesia Area Research Center seminar series. We'd love to hear your comments on the show. You can contact us on Facebook at 670 Humanities. And if you'd like to hear more Humanities Half Hour, subscribe to our YouTube channel at northernmarianashumanities.org. This has been your Humanities Half Hour. I'm Catherine Perry.
This program was supported by a We the People grant awarded to the Northern Marianas Humanities Council from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities or the Northern Marianas Humanities Council.